I'm James Jolly, and I'm thrilled to be sitting down and chatting with some of my musical heroes. Welcome to this episode of Music Makers, a series in which we get to meet some of the most talented musicians on the planet. Finland has produced an amazing host of musicians for a country of its size, and among its composers, Kaija Saariaho, a long-time resident of Paris, has attracted a huge international following for her scrupulously constructed and exquisitely crafted music. Her opera L'amour de loin, first heard in the millennial year 2000, was a major milestone in a career that has gone from strength to strength. A real music maker, I'm looking forward to discovering what compels Kaija Saariaho to compose and how she found her unique musical voice. Thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. Music Makers is the name of the series, and you're very much a music maker. I hope I'm not being too optimistic when I say, you know, as a species, we're emerging from this extraordinary 2 years, something the world has never seen before. And if one can extract any positives from it, certainly in the English-speaking world, there's been a kind of recalibration. You know, diversity and gender balance have become much more important. And I was thinking, you know, for you as a girl, when you discovered you had a kind of a need, a desire to make music, who would your sort of role models have been back then? Because they weren't.
Interesting. Indeed, they were not. And later I discovered that there would have been some, but nobody know about them. And I didn't know either. Living in Finland, not having internet, and reduced amount of accessibility to material. But in fact, yes, there were no woman models for me in music. But in literature, yes, more generally in artistic world. But mostly because I did read much, especially poetry. There were women who had lived artist life and whom I admired a lot.
I mean, did you grow up in a musical family? I mean, was music around you in your childhood?
My family was not at all musical. It was very simple family when I was small. My parents came from very poor conditions after the war. My father's family moved from Karelia, which became part of Russia, so they moved to Helsinki. And my mother came from countryside, really, on the border. And it was a simple family. And the music I learned to know first from the radio, because we had this old-fashioned radio, you know, that you could play with, and I spent quite a lot sick days at home, so I was playing with the radio, and then later we had a smaller radio at the country house. So by listening a lot of radio, that's how I really learned to know music first.
And I get the impression, I mean, certainly, you know, from your music and the way you've used, is that its sound in any sort of form is you're very sensitive to sound. You know, what's going on around you and what makes that sound and why is that sound like that?
Yes. I think in my mind the sound is combined with the impressions of colors and sometimes even smells. And that might come also from my childhood, spending so much time in nature, very much time in forests, and admiring the different acoustics in forests, and by the lakeside, all the natural sounds, of course birds, but I liked always very much. And maybe also because I listened to the music at the country house where we had birds and the nature around us, then it seemed very natural that they can be part of the music. In a way, it's the first music.
And were you also conscious of sort of acoustics back then? Because, you know, if you hear a sound in a wood and you hear a sound on a lake, it's a very different sound. You know, you're hearing overtones, you're hearing echoes, you're hearing, you know, sort of other elements of that sound.
Yes, that impressed me a lot. In fact, my favorite thing was to go to woods after the rain, because then, because the leaves were damp, it was so resonant. The forest was resonant, and when the birds started singing again, it was really wonderful event. And other thing that made me very aware of acoustic was the different kinds of snows, because when it's very cold and the snow is very dry, then it really dampens the air when you go out, and it's the silence is like nowhere. So I think, yes, it has to do also with nature very much.
Because silence can have so many qualities. I mean, you know, when one thinks of silence, one thinks there's nothing there, but actually there are, you know, it's like the color white. There are so many different colors of white. There are so many different shades of silence as well.
Indeed, it's beautiful.
It is beautiful, yeah. So when you discovered a need to make music, was the need to make music, did that sort of come before almost the language to make the music with? I mean, was it the sort of the desire to create something came before how you could actually express it?
Well, to make music, it's not maybe a good expression for me, because I did start play. I played many instruments, but I never liked performing, and it never became for me a physical need to play any of those instruments. But to imagine music, I think I started imagining it as long as I remember. And then later, well, I was a small child, but then later at some point I realized only the thing about composition, because I was all the time this music in my mind, but I had it, but it seemed so natural. So there was not yet any need to communicate it. That came later, that I realized what is composition, and I also realized that composition is work, and it needs to be studied as much as all the instruments, that there is technique. First I was very frustrated that why am I not able to do it, even if I had all these things in my mind. Well, that's because I didn't know how to do it.
Is when you know, I listen to your music, there seem to me there are two instruments that you're particularly drawn to that feature a lot in you. One is the flute and the other is the cello. They seem to weave through your music, and you know, maybe because you've had wonderful performers on those both instruments. I mean, at first, am I right? I mean, are you particularly drawn to those instruments, or are they just part of the huge panoply as a composer you've got to work with?
At the beginning of my professional work, those two instruments were very important, and for different reasons. Flute I like because it has a mouthpiece that allows you to very gradually go from whispering or airy sounds like wind to very pure music, and these kind of transitions are important in my music. Cello, because it has very large tessitura, and it's very good size for making different kind of bow changes carefully, again changing the color. So, and then I had two wonderful musicians, Camilla Hoitenga, the flutist, and Anssi Karttunen, who very naturally grew into my music, and it was easy to collaborate.
Because both those instruments, you're very conscious of the person playing it. You know, there's a sort of real sense of humanity. You know, you know it's a human being playing this. It's not a, you know, it's not in any kind sort of mechanical. It's just, you know, it's a very visceral sound. I mean, is that what you liked as well? The you know, the fact that somebody was playing it and their personality could come through your music.
Well, always I think very physically, the act of playing when I write to some instrument, and but really physically how their body works. Also for singing, I think about a lot how where the sound is in the body. And for me, it is important. It's somehow to helps me to imagine exactly the music that is coming into my mind that I'm trying to put on paper. And of course it helps, especially if I write a concerto or solo piece for a person that I know. Of course, something of that personality comes to the music, and that's fun, or it's helpful, or it's challenging, but it gives one more dimension.
And it must be interesting though, when you've written a piece for one person and you hear somebody else play it, because does it give a sort of perspective that maybe you hadn't even imagined when you wrote the piece, somebody else's personality acting?
It can happen. It can happen when it's another good performance.
Sure.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. But yeah, it's beautiful, and that's really good feeling then also to understand that even if I have been thinking of someone specific, I can see that the music is now there and it can be shared with many different people.
Well, I mean, what is your sort of relationship to a piece of music once you have written it, you've given it over to the performers have given it the first performance, and then it starts its own journey on its own, a bit like sending a child out into the world. I mean, do you retain a sort of interest in, as it were, your musical offspring?
Well, interest, yes, but not any kind of obsessive way of wanting to control things or something like that. And even the interest, it depends on the moment. If I'm working on something very demanding, then it takes time before I, for example, listen to the recordings of the performance. But of course I'm interested. It's fantastic if people want to perform my music, and makes me really happy that they want to communicate it.
Are you a reviser at all? Do you tend to, you know, when you've written a work, is that it, or do you go back and say, actually, I'd like to change this and I'd like to change that, or do you consider the work finished, truly finished?
I revise very little, very little.
Yeah.
Sometimes there are some obvious mistakes, or sometimes, well, in fact, always some problems with dynamics, especially in bigger works. But to musically, to say that, oh no, that was musically completely wrong, that cannot come to my mind. No, it's somehow that I dive to the project. I realize it's in my mind. It's getting more and more heavy. I need to realize and complete it. And when it's there, when we had then finally the first performance, I say finally because this COVID time was really special for that. We had to wait a long time.
Yes, I was going to say, it must be unusual in your career where you've got works, as it were, sort of backed up that you haven't yet heard or hadn't yet heard, and you were presumably still composing. You know, there must have been this weird period, which is unusual for a composer.
Very unusual, and in fact very heavy in that sense that I cannot let go before we have had the premiere and heard and assured all these dynamic things and whatever. And so I had in my mind my latest opera, big orchestra piece. In fact, I had 5 pieces that were postponed, and my mind was so heavy with that music that I didn't compose for a while. So I didn't realize that it's so important.
You have to kind of give birth and then you can move on.
Kind of, yeah.
I mean, you've got a number, I mean, quite a lot of composers who've done it, but quite a lot of works have grown out of other works. I mean, is that something that you suddenly, I mean, what's the sort of impetus to, as it were, you know, revisit a work, but an element of that work?
Oh, it has to do with the material.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes there is material that I really want to take into other context, or that it had, I was not able in the first piece to develop enough, or not even develop, or just sometimes take quite a lot of the same material, but put it into another light. So it's my material. If I want to give a new view on it, then I do it. But it doesn't happen also always. Yeah. Sometimes it's like, okay, it's done. There is nothing to be added.
Because I mean, one of my favourite works of yours is the piece for string quartet and electronics, Navia, and that spawned a sort of offspring, which was, I mean, you know, for people who like the original, this was a sort of extra treat. Wow, you know, there's more to come.
That was interesting in that sense that the string quartet was with electronics, and then the string orchestra piece, I wanted to reinterpret the electronic effects without electronics. So that was what we hear. So that was interesting challenge, and more generally I like very much to give myself challenges. I would not like to repeat myself.
Yeah. Let's talk a bit about electronics, because you know they have formed a part of your career, and to an extent that's why you live in Paris, because you were sort of in pursuit of a sound, perhaps. I mean, where did your interest in sort of enhancing the acoustic sound with electronic sound come from, and where did the germs start from?
Well, in fact, that started already when I was a child. My father had this tape recorder, and I liked sometimes to sing into it, mic very close or further. I liked very much to my voice when I had sang some, you know, children's songs, the mic very close. And I still don't understand why my father had that tape recorder, because I don't remember that he ever used it. But anyway, so the awareness of the mic sound came already then. And then, of course, as teenager, I loved all kinds of music, but also Jimi Hendrix, and liked to hear Billie Holiday, and using the mic as the jazz singers do. And then when I went to study to Sibelius Academy, there was a studio, electronic music studio, and then Finnish radio had electronic music studio. So already in my first pieces I went to work there. So it seemed very natural, and then there were also very concrete reasons. For example, the first concerts we gave as a student in Sibelius Academy, they were given in an art exhibition hall, and the acoustic was very horrible. So it also brought me to the studio to see how could I create my own acoustics, and easily, yes, of course, by amplifying, and that brought me to use the reverberations and so on. Then I continued studies in Freiburg, where there was a good studio, and then in '82 I was accepted to do a course at IRCAM, and that then brought me closer to all the then very new digital technology.
Because, I mean, IRCAM is a sort of legendary place, you know, I mean, it's Pierre Boulez is kind of, it was sort of his empire. I mean, your music, I mean, was Boulez, I mean, I get the feeling that Boulez wasn't particularly influential on you as a composer, but more perhaps in the way he explored electronics. I don't know, is that, I don't get the sense that
no, he was not one of the important persons for me musically.
Yeah. I mean, you know, we talked about, you know, not having gender sort of, roles to follow when you were smaller. I mean, when you came to IRCAM, I mean, were women composers or women technicians or programmers, I mean, were they still relatively rare back then?
Yes, they were rare. Yes, yes, it's true. It was rare. I mean, all my study times, it was quite rare still. Except in Freiburg, we were several. One had come from Canada, one American, one good friend came from Hong Kong. So that was the first time I really met young women who were also composers. And then, of course, at Darmstadt, we in the courses it was more international, but it was strangely rare in Finland or other Nordic countries at that time. And in IRCAM, yeah, well, I'm not a techno freak. And
I mean, was that complicated, you know? I mean, because it's like a completely new discipline. I mean, out of, you know, in a completely new area, you know, playing around with electronics and computers and...
Of course, it was super complicated, but there were some interesting programs which were kind of new kind. One was called the program Chant, which was like when you started working on that program, there were already all parameters of a voice, and then you could change these parameters. It was more directly to do with the sound again than starting really programming for you know. Like the earlier programs where you started from scratch and you needed to be able really to program. I'm not at all good programmer, but I had a chance to have good people around me, and to start with Jean-Baptiste, my husband now, whom I learned to know at IRCAM. But as such, anyway, I'm not interested in technology. I'm interested what we can do with it, and that was a fantastic place for me then, because I was always so interested in sound. And there was a psychoacoustics. There was a very famous psychoacoustician, Stephen McAdams, who is now in Montreal. There were acoustic department, so all one could learn about sound, that I wanted to understand more how sound is behaving, and for example, why at that time all the digital music sounded so dead when you made them with these first programs. It was because it was simple and because it didn't have that constant life that any live sound has, meaning that if you even try to, the violinist trying for 15 years to learn to have the bow straight and make the very stable vibrato, it's never. There are always micro changes, and that's why we realize right away that this sound is a live sound, and that affected much my orchestration.
Because one of the things that, you know, when you start exploring electronic, you know, sounds, you're analysing sounds, you are actually giving sound a visual element. You can actually see the shape of the sound. You can see, gosh, I didn't know it could do that, or why is it doing that? I mean, that must, because you said early on, you know, you're the connection between visual and audio and even smell. I mean, did actually being able to see sound, that must have been quite exciting, and it gives you an extra sort of perspective on why does that sound like that, because I can see it.
Of course, but you know what? That time we couldn't see.
So it was that primitive.
The technology has changed completely. No, you cannot even imagine what happened that time. It was laptops didn't exist. Nothing of that exists. We all were working with a computer which was as big as this. How do you say it? Wall yeah. There. And that's why, for example, we went there often with Jean-Baptiste to work nighttime, because it was time-sharing system. And you couldn't calculate one sound of 7 seconds. It took a really long time. And if you wanted to, when you were creating sounds, you wanted to do something more substantial. You started a calculation, you went to have dinner, and you came back to see if the calculation was broken or not. You went to sleep, you came back in the morning and you saw that the calculation was broken. So nothing came out. So it was
a slow process.
It was not real time.
And of course now you just have a laptop and it's done in you know, a millisecond.
Yes, yeah. So that was very different.
So when you when did you start sort of exploring adding electronic music to, you know, for sake of argument, the acoustic element of music?
Well, that happened well in the beginning, because I had a piece. Early piece for soprano, electronics, and light. And for the electronics, I used material from glass. I recorded glass, and then I treated it with these old fashioned tape recorders, and so that was one of my first pieces. But then came a period that I really wanted to really create instrumental music and find my language. And then I think the next time that I started adding material, that was then in Paris, starting from the beginning of 80s.
Because I mean, you know, to return to Nymphéa, which is a work that I'm kind of, I wouldn't say obsessed with, but it's a work that fascinates me, because, you know, the string quartet is just an amazing thing. You know, it's been around since, I don't know, you know, sort of the middle of the 18th century, and it still works for composers today. And Nymphéa sort of takes the string quartet, but somehow, without losing the string quartetness of the sound, it sort of enhances it. I mean, what impelled you to sort of, as it were, expand the capability of the string quartet?
Well, first of all, the idea of writing a string quartet scared me a lot, because there are so many.
Because of the tradition?
Yes, yes. But then the commission came from Kronos Quartet, and they would be ready for anything I wanted to do. Then I thought that, well, writing for string quartet, but then using the quartet sounds to change them. I thought that would be a way to open the tradition. And then there happened to be that time there was a new kind of one of the first smaller digital mixers, because the one thing is that when you make live electronics, at that time you couldn't easily do many things at the same time. And then came this digital mixer, so I could, beforehand, I could program different effects for different instruments, and I knew that it would be possible to mix it in the concert. So here, for example, the technology gave me this idea of doing it this way, because before also using live electronics in a concert with several instruments was very complicated because you needed to mix things by hand, and then you needed different people to do it, and so all that has changed so enormously.
Did you used to actually physically take part in the mixing yourself in the early days?
Oh, I had to do it.
Yeah.
Nobody could do it except for me, and I still do sometimes, of course.
Because it makes you a sort of performer as part of the lineup.
Yeah, but the nice thing is that you are not on stage. You are somewhere in the hall.
Are you a sort of shy person when it comes to that sort of situation? I mean, do you even like going up on stage at the end of a performance?
No, I don't like it. Yes, I'm shy because I feel myself very clumsy about it. And in fact, when my first opera was created at the Salzburg Festival in 2000, and it was directed by Peter Sellars. And at some point he told me that I cannot watch that anymore, that as soon as you get on the stage you want to run away. And now we rehearse it. And then we rehearsed it, so I come to the stage. I know that people want to see me. I start looking slowly from left to right, being kind to people. I resist my panic, and so this is how I do it still now, after more than 20 years.
Because there is that strange, I mean, sort of disconnect. I remember talking to Esa-Pekka Salonen, one of your regular contributors, and he said it always amuses him that if he's invited to a festival as a conductor, when he gets on the plane, he turns left and sits in the expensive seats. When he's invited to a festival as a composer, he turns right and he's put in the sort of cheap seats. And you do think, yes, who is the music maker? The period of the subject of our conversation today. I mean, who is the music maker in this case? It's the composer, surely.
Well, it's a divided job. The music doesn't exist without musicians. I appreciate very much always the musicians, especially being myself, not even dreaming about playing publicly. So I find it extremely important, and I always would like to share the success of my music with the musicians.
Because of course, being a composer, as we said earlier, you letting the piece go, it is then, you as it were, you've given it to the musicians. Yes. In a way, your work is done.
Yes, that's what I feel.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, let's talk about some of the partnerships, because you've worked with some extraordinary people down the years. I mean, Esa-Pekka Salonen is probably, one of your oldest collaborators, in that you kind of, almost sort of grew up musically together, and he's championed you.
Yeah, we studied together.
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, what is it that he brings? Just an understanding of your music? Or?
Well, he understands it, of course, because he knows it from the beginning. And then, he's a great musician. He communicates so well with the orchestra. So I'm always in good hands with him, because he has all the past, and he's composer himself. So
do you think that makes a difference when a composer is interpreting your music? Do they bring a different dimension to interpreting it, an understanding perhaps?
Well, it not necessarily, in fact, but in his case, yes, and in some other cases, yes. But there are great conductors who do understand my music. I think it depends quite a lot how they perceive the music, and how well they can imagine the music when they read it, and how well they can adjust the different parameters. If somebody is maniac about the rhythmic perfectness, then it's not somebody for my music, because I like it to be breathe and be flexible, and I see it as really like a living material, because always the conditions are different. The halls are different, the musicians, orchestras are different. So I would like everybody to find their view on the music. And certainly it's not something putting strictly in place. Of course everything needs to be in place, but there are much more important things than after that we need to find.
Because I think people would be quite surprised to hear you say that, because I think there's a sort of general belief that with new music, you know, the composer is very careful to notate exactly what he or she wants. But actually you saying, well, no, there's a bit of, you know, there's some give and take, there's extra musical things to add to
no, I didn't say that. I said, of course it's important that my music is interpreted as I write it. But then after that, it needs to be really interpreted. It needs to get life. It's not enough to play the notes. And you are right. People think that new music needs to be like that and strictly like that, and that in fact there is no feeling behind it. It's just this cold technology of today. Well, it's not. At least not my music is not. And new music, how many different kinds of new musics there are, you know. And there are certainly composers who like cold perfection, if that can be given by human beings.
Do you take an interest in your fellow composers' work, or is it something you kind of keep on the periphery? I mean, are you part of a sort of, you know, a world that you're interested in, what Salonen's been writing, or what Magnus Lindberg or Dussapin, or, you know, any number of living composers?
Of course I'm interested, but then it depends again the moment when I'm working. If I'm working with something large and important and deep, then I don't much listen other people's music. But of course I'm interested, one should be. And I'm not only interested in music, I'm interested in the world around us. And that's how it should be.
Yeah. And what about the sort of the, you know, the canon, the traditional repertoire that gets done, you know, 80% of our concert live? I mean, does that still interest you? I mean,
there's a lot of music I love. I love so much. And there is a lot of music I still don't know enough, even I've heard it all my life. Yes, I really love music. But that there also it's very interesting how it is performed. You know, even all the classics that we know, it can be performed so wonderfully and it can be so boring. So that's also interesting.
I really get the sense sort of that the life of music is terribly important to you, that music has to live. It can't just sort of exist. It actually has to have a sort of beating heart somewhere in it. Because as you were saying, you know, you can go to a concert which may be immaculate, but it actually is utterly dead. You know, there's no communication at all.
Well, the communication is so important for me. That's why I'm mentioning the breathing, and I mean we are all humans, and we are living horrible times, and music it's so important aspect of human cultures. There has not been human culture without music until now, and now when everything is so commercial and everything is valued by money, so for example my kind of music, it's getting into peripheria, and I'm afraid for my younger colleagues, and you know, all kind of species die, maybe my kind of music will die, and that's why I think that's not why, but that's one of the reasons that I'm very aware that all music that we create, that there's a possibility to communicate the things that we want to communicate. Music is a secret thing. it's a hugely powerful, so much more powerful than words, because it touches us. I don't know how it works, but there is music which goes so deeply that I really don't understand how it works. That's one reason maybe that I compose, because I'm all the time trying to find a way to understand more.
And when you write a piece of music, are you doing it to enrich sort of the human experience, or do you think writing a piece of music, the beauty of a piece of music somehow makes the world a better place? I mean, what is behind the need to write a piece of music?
When I compose, I don't compose for other people.
Mm-hmm.
I compose because I want to find a way to express this music that I imagine. And yes, it's a little bit difficult thing. It doesn't necessarily make the world a better place. But music can help maybe people to find different horizons in themselves. Maybe they can realize that it's really one of the important things in life, like love is important, like health is important, and those things you cannot value with money. And maybe it can give you new ideas to live your life as you really would like to do it, or then maybe not. And then maybe one person can find something in it, and maybe music can change one person, and maybe it can spread. I mean, important things, all spiritual and you know, all arts. They have a healing power also, if we take time to let it happen. So I don't put too much hope on it.
But every little work of art, being it just a tiny painting or an opera, almost provides a little lens that somebody may look through it,
Yes.
and change them. However,
I think so. And think about the music that has survived for centuries. Music like some of my favorites, like Bach, of course. Every composer says Bach. But then Monteverdi, how their music survived, how enormous power they have still on us, and how, for me, that music, for example, is very healing in many situations. But that's only one function. I mean, in society there are so many functions that music has, and the music is so flexible. So it's just a wonder.
because I mean, you know, something like, I don't know, Monteverdi's Coronation of Poppaea shows us that all these 100 years later, we as humans haven't changed at all. You know, our emotions, our drives, our impetuses, you know, our desires are exactly the same, but portrayed in such an unbelievable way. I mean, when you get to the duet at the end of the opera, you can't help but feel changed and just, you know, breathtaken at the sort of the beauty of the writing and the emotions behind it. It is absolutely extraordinary. I mean,
That's the interesting thing about opera, that you always you are drawn to it as a person, as yourself, and somehow, consciously or not, you leave these things with these people, and it gives you something back concerning your own life. That's very strange. That's what makes opera and concert music so different. So you are right. It can really change you.
because your first opera, L'Amour de Loin, which I mean, it sort of strikes me as interesting that the works that sort of land on the start of a century, or the start in this case of a millennium, there's something, I don't know, there's something very charged about the years around the change of a century. If you go back through music history, you know, there's always sort of extraordinary works come within 2 or 3 years of the millennium. But L'amour de loin is, I mean, you know, it was your first opera, and it's been one of your most successful creations. I mean, in many ways, I suppose, career-changing. But that was a result of an extraordinary coming together of sort of 3 creative beings. I mean, you, Peter Sellers, Armin Malouf as the librettist, which I would have thought when you're making your first opera, to have 2 people like that to work with must have been enormously inspiring and helpful.
Yeah, but they came much later. I mean, yes, it was fantastic to work with them, but I had been starting work on the opera much earlier, so all the storyline and everything, I had it already. I had already appointment with another poet, French poet, for example. But yes, and I would have never come to think about Amin as a librettist, because he had never done that kind of work, and that was Peter's idea. And Peter, I was so happy to have him finally for my opera, but he didn't want to do it first. He felt that he could add nothing to that, but I admired his work already then enormously.
Because I mean, one of the elements that opera has that, you know, other forms of music is it, you kind of need dramatic shape. You know, the opera has to, you know, has to have its sort of peaks and troughs. It has to move towards certain points. It has to take you on an emotional journey. You know, it has to resolve or not. I mean, there's a huge undertaking, you know, to take on. You know,
it is, yeah.
And it worked amazing. I mean, did Peter Sellers help you on the sort of the dramaturgical journey of
No. But we did discuss a lot the libretto first with Amin. He let me read through different versions, and then he asked me to mark with plus and minus things that I liked or didn't like, and we did that very much together. But I mean, the form was... I always designed the form first. And I had spent so much time already before I got the libretto, in fact, because it took really too long time from Amin to do it, because he had never lived with deadlines before. So he didn't really understand then that every week he took was away from me. So, but I knew that whatever my dramaturgy of my music would be, that Peter would find a way to make an opera of it, because one of my important experiences was to see his Saint François d'Assise of Messiaen, and I had seen the first version, and it seemed to me like oratorio, and then there was suddenly this unbelievable opera on stage. So that's why I, in the first hand, really wanted to have him. I knew I would be in good hands.
So with L'Amour de Loin in 2000, I mean, it's an opera that's taken on a real life of its own. I mean, it's been performed many places, but it also opened the door to opera for you. And after that, you've created, I would have said 5 operas. Some people may say 4, but I like to see La Passion de Simone more operatic than anything else. I mean, to take on operas like that, I mean, it must be much more time consuming. I mean, it must eat out an enormous amount of your year or 2 years. I mean, how much time do you if somebody says, I'd like you to write me an opera, in your mind, you think, well, that's 2 years of my life to devote to this task?
It's much more.
More.
In my case, it's much more. And when I had written L'Amour de Loin, I was thinking that, okay, now I did my opera. I never thought that I would write more of them. I didn't see myself at all like opera composer, and I even had a feeling that I like Wozzeck, but I never liked Lulu, so I had a feeling that the first one is the best. So why to write the second one? But then it's true that the working then with other artists, it's very, very interesting. And then if the collaboration is successful, then the result is really carrying the music, is giving even much more. It becomes very strong work. But I felt for a while that I will not go back to there because it was very tiring work, psychologically also concerning the characters and all that. But then it was this idea of collaboration that drew me back to try more things and then have another kinds of ideas, and every time have different kinds of ideas. And I think right now, because Innocence is not very far yet, that might have been my last opera, at least the biggest one. Here I tried challenges that I had never done before. There are 9 languages, there are 13 persons, there are very different kinds of ways of using the voice, so I don't know what happens and that altogether, work on Innocence, it was 5-6 years at least.
I mean, what drew you to that as a theme? Because I mean, it's quite a shocking theme. It's an opera about a kind of terrorist event. What drew you to that particular subject matter? Because it's quite a jump from stuff you'd done before. You know, a very, very visceral, in your face kind of theme.
It was not that subject matter at all.
Mm-hmm.
It was the idea of how a group of people live one event always so differently, and what kind of event it would be. I mean, my first idea was just I was imagining a group of tourists coming to see the Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper. And there are these 30 persons, and then there are these group Japanese tourists, and they are all in front of that painting. And then, what goes on in their life? Does this have some? They encounter all these people accidentally. Does it have something to do with their life? What do they think about those 13 persons? Do they know about their history and all that? So that was my first idea. And then when we started developing it, I felt I need to have a writer. I was thinking I would like to work with Finnish writer. And I came to Sofi Oksanen, whose books I like very much, and who is very interested, very good dramaturgically. Then I also started to thinking that this would be the moment to realize my dream about having all different languages in one work, in one opera, because every language is inviting a little bit different kind of music. And I realized then with Sophie, had never written librettos. And I contacted Alexis Barrière, who is also my son, but with whom we have worked a lot together. He has, for my choir music, he has written 4 times different texts, and he knows my music, poor boy, since he's, very early age. So we decided to worked, 3 of us together, and then Alexi was like dramaturging the text with Sophie, and then doing all the translations. And then 3 of us, we discussed what then could be, okay, I wanted to have many languages. I had this idea of group of people living something extraordinary, and the consequences. Well, then we discussed many different things, and then we had 3 candidates in the end, and then with Alexi we decided or gave Sophie to make the choice. And by then already we had decided that we would have 13 persons in it, and so there were the 2 conditions to have a natural way to use all the languages. So we had already discussed the idea of international school, and this theme was one of our candidates, and then Sophie chose that. And then we decided that, but this is not story about the killer, because this is something that also discusses me always when this happens again and again. Now less, but normally it was this killer who came to the media, and some of them did it because of that, to have this fame. And so then it became very interesting. We made research, and Sophie especially, of different cases. It has happened in Finland also, and then that's why we decided that it would happen in Finland, because it would be so easy to put it to United States, but that really it can happen anywhere. And so it's about these people who lived it. It's about the parents and their children, and their relations, about the mother who lost her child. So it became, and then I wanted to have it only one formal curve, so that there would not be intermission. I really didn't want, so my challenge was then also this time to make it short enough, so that it would be only max 1 hour 45 minutes. So that's how it came, and really the killer we wanted to keep outside of the libretto and music. But that has been fantastic collaboration with 2 of them, but it was very tiring, because already in opera I need to put myself in the person's place, and there were 2 mothers to start with, and who were really involved in, their children were involved in this, and then everybody else. So there were 13 persons who were trying to recover in a trauma, and some maybe success, some not. So to living in those ideas, it was actively then, the active composition time was a little bit more than 3 years. But before that, we used a couple of years already.
I want to talk about a work that I have no justification for suggesting this, but my feeling is that it's very close to your heart as a work, and that's La Passion de Simone. To me, it speaks with, there's a different dimension to it. It just feels a very personal work. And this is the work that could be construed as an oratorio, that, though, as I said, and I think you agree, it's probably slightly more operatic, but it sort of scooped up a relationship you've had with the writings of the philosopher Simone Weil since you were very young, and probably before you even maybe understood the whole extent of what she was writing about.
I'm not sure I still understand, but you're right. It's very important for me. It's yeah. There are so many important things what I find important in human life and human behavior. That it's very special work for me, and I don't undersign everything what she said or what she did, and I'm quoting her texts. I don't agree with her, but they are there because it shows how she was and how one can also think. And yes, that's really dear work for me.
Because, I mean, essentially her philosophy, if I understand it, boiled down to the sort of, you know, the real concentrated bit. There's a sort of compassion that forced her into action. That's, you know, if one had to sort of say, well, you know, what's Simone Weil all about? I mean, she lived an extraordinarily, I mean, it was an amazing life, really. A sort of example of how to live as a human being in the world we are today. I mean, that deep compassion for her fellow human beings.
She tried, yes, but it was partly this compassion that made her die quite young. But she was completely, well, I think she was a genius because she was so intelligent, and in her notebooks there are philosophy, there are mathematical writing, everything is like mixed, and I had a feeling when I was really young that she had this, that I had something similar in me in that sense, that I was trying to find the truth through different means, and that's why that she had this obsession, and she used all the means she had mentally, which were enormous. But then she didn't only have these huge mental power, she had this compassion, which was like overmeasured. And then she was not very healthy. She was quite tiny and quite clumsy person. And then, but she wanted to like participate to Spanish War, and she wanted to go to work to the factory and really feel how these people were working there. Every time she got really very sick, every time something quite horrible happened. But she still has extraordinary clarity in her thinking, and I think there was a prevision that people start to understand only now. So yeah, she was really, and when I started working for the La Passion de Simone, I thought, well, now I take this time and I read nothing else but her writings, and maybe I finally really understand it. And then I composed a piece, and I asked myself, did I really understand it? Did I really? But there are things that touch me very much.
When you wrote the piece, did you have the performer in mind?
Yes.
Ultimately.
Yeah, I wrote the soprano part for Dawn Upshaw, and at some point she did sing it, but she couldn't sing the premiere. She was not well that period. But yes, it's very much her voice in my mind.
Because there are, you know, you've written for, I mean, Karita Mattila, who's another extraordinary performer. And we were sort of talking before we started this interview about it. I just find it amazing that when you encounter an artist who is not just a great artist, but is a sort of extraordinary human being at the same time. And Mattila just seems to me one of those amazing people who's just such a sort of big human being, in that, you know, she's got so much to offer, both as a person and as an artist.
She is a fantastic person.
Yeah.
Something that I have realized when I think about all the people that I've been so fascinated with and working for, they have all been also very intelligent persons, and not completely egomaniac, you know, understanding their own talent, but also being quite self-critical, like I think all the big ones maybe need to be to come there, and but also have this big heart, and that gives them the power perform as they do.
Could one see Adriana Mater, La Passion de Simon and Emily as a kind of very loose triptych about three extraordinary women, or is it just sort of happenstance that they kind of created a little trio? Because
well, maybe they could, but I would then I see it a little bit differently. I see it through the subject matter, because Adriana Mater was done with Amin, and I wanted to bring the subject of motherhood into it, because I realized that it was interpreted very stereotypically always in opera, and then Amin wanted to bring the subject of war. He had been war reporter a long time, but he had never, it was a very private thing for him, he had never written a book about it. And so I see Adriana as an encounter of these two subjects. Well, and then Émilie and La Passion came just after Adriana Mater, and yes, it has very much to do with Simone Weil. And then Émilie has very much to do with Émilie du Châtelet. So maybe those two are like one thing. And now when I think about Adriana Mater and Innocence, I feel that those two maybe have something in common too.
Yeah. What drew you to? I mean, Émilie du Châtelet was an extraordinary sort of early 18th century. I mean, very, very intelligent woman. She I suppose her most famous thing was translating one of Newton's great treatises. But she was the lover of Voltaire. They worked together. She was, you know, sort of intelligentsia, short-lived as well. But just one of those amazing figures that the more you read about her, you just think, wow, she was just so sort of ahead of her time in many respects. I mean, after a while, you sort of, you know, you just think, how could you have to have achieved all that at that time? You know, where she basically came to an agreement with her husband that she was going to sort of go off and do her own thing, you know, as an intellectual and move in completely different circles. It's a very inspiring story.
It is really. But what made me then interested to use it in opera is especially her sad end of her life, because she was doing the translation of Newton at the same time as she realized that she was pregnant, and she had had children earlier already. They were adults, I think, but she was 42, and that age it was of course very dangerous. And so that she really had this race to try to finish the translation, because she felt that that would leave a mark of herself to the history, because all that she could publish before that was not on her name. And even all the scientific meetings where she went, she was wearing men's clothes, because it was otherwise unheard of. So I think that even if they were not together with Voltaire anymore, that Voltaire had made a promise that this will be published in her name. And at the same time there was this pregnancy that advanced. So it was so strange situation, all these facets of her life that were so concretely at that moment then present.
It's a lovely opera. Let's finish by talking about a work that it's not a new work. It's sort of pre-pandemic, I think. And this is Vista, the work that is going to come to is in Paris, and it's already had quite a life of its own. I mean, Susanna Melki has been championing it very much. I mean, she seems to be one of your Finnish sort of champions of your music. I mean, she, I guess, a bit like Esa-Pekka, has a sympathy for your music.
Susanna has been conducting much my music. She conducted the first performance of Le Première of La Passion de Simon, and that's a while ago already. So, yes, she is. Right now, she's in a splendor of her work, I think, because she has the freedom and she has the power, and that seemed very well. The Vista was the idea for Vista came from her Finnish orchestra, the Finnish how do you say, Helsinki Philharmonic Orchestra, and so it was naturally then she who would conduct the premiere. But Vista, I realized quite recently that after every opera, I have written orchestra piece. And it must be kind of a wild feeling of freedom, that I don't need to accompany singers or other soloists, and that I can just write all I imagine for the orchestra. And it was the case here also.
Because it's a wonderfully virtuoso. I mean, to say it's a showpiece is probably not quite right, but it's a wonderful celebration of what the orchestra can do as a piece.
Yeah, well, it comes from that joy that I could just concentrate on orchestra, a big orchestra. Yes.
I'm sure Parisian audiences are looking forward to it for the first performance here in France. But Kaija, thank you so much for your time and for sharing your wisdom and experience with us. It's been really enjoyable.
For me as well. Thank you very much.
Do you use other objects to make music apart from sort of traditional instruments?
Well, especially in percussion music, any object that you can hit or rub can be an instrument.
Are you more comfortable surrounded by noise or silence?
Absolutely silence. I'm very uncomfortable with noise.
If you could choose the sound of your doorbell, what would it be?
Well, some kind of nice, gentle bell sound, maybe.
What is the sound you wake up to?
I just wake up.
If your life was a movie, what would your theme song be?
It could be love, love, love.
What to you is the most relaxing sound?
Well, nature has many relaxing sounds.
And what's the most irritating?
Well, of course, insistent alarm or these cars alarms that start on the street.
What sound reminds you most of home?
There's no sound that reminds me of home.
What's the first sound you remember hearing?
Must be nature, must be forest, and that's at least the first I remember, the birds, different birds.
What sound makes you think immediately of a happy memory or a happy place?
Different musics, of course, but I cannot name one.
And what for you is the most musical sound not made by an instrument?
Birds.